witnessing. He was an observer of manifestations of the spirit world, whether it was through automatic writing, through particular messages that had no other explanation, through apparitions or other phenomena, ectoplasm, where suddenly the material, this very fluid material, comes out of the medium's body and hovers around. Full body apparitions, etc. He understood this as evidence that there was no other coherent explanation than communication with the spirit world. So this systematic observation fulfilled the methodological requirements of science. Right? Systematic observation and then the evaluation, the rational evaluation of that sort of empirical data would then allow him to form laws, to evaluate and create and discover particular spiritual laws that had relevance to earthly existence. So if we look then to the laws, and hopefully you start to see some of the similarities with Kantian positivism. Some of the most fundamental of these laws, or the most significant of these laws that Kardec claimed to have discovered, is that he claimed to have discovered and empirically verified the existence of and immortality of a spirit or soul, one that was independent of matter, but that interacted with matter, and that went through multiple existences, that went through multiple material existences. So he proposed reincarnation as an explanation for the immortality of the soul within the spirit world, that you had this constant interaction. And in fact, this interaction, the second law, is purposeful. That there's a progression, there's an evolution from a state of delusion to a purification of this delusion through the tests that human existence demanded of one, and that this led to a kind of eventual perfection of the spirit. Okay? And this was something that happened both individually for individual spirits, but the broader phenomena, because it was happening cumulatively for all of these spirits, it was also collective. And so he called this the law of progress, that spirits evolved from a state of ignorance to a state of perfection, or a state of understanding. And then the third is something that I mentioned already, which is that that agents, actions, and the consequences of actions are inseparable. Not that they form a complete unity, but simply that to posit otherwise is to negate the law of cause and effect. Right? And here, Kardec is sort of balancing a reinterpretation of the idea of karma with a physical understanding of cause and effect in the material world. So it's something. It actually ends up being a fairly basic thing that can be boiled down to, and this is what you would get basically in seances, is if you do good things, you advance. Things become better for you. Things become better for others. If you do bad things, then you suffer more. You're more deluded. You're less perfect and less at peace. Okay? And this was essentially the law of cause and effect at work. Okay? So now I'm going to turn to the leading figure of Kardecist Spiritism in Argentina, a man named Cosme Marinho, who really was actually a really interesting figure. He's the only person that who I've ever really worked with who was almost killed by a nun. He was coming out of a conference, and a nun who later claimed that she was a spiritist as an excuse for her hysteria and the resulting attempt on Marinho's life. He's coming out of a conference, and he's walking with a number of other very prominent spiritists, one of whom was the discoverer of the sweetness of stevia, the artificial sweetener, a guy named Revaldi, was coming out, and she called out Marinho to see who he was. He turned. She got off 2 shots before one of the people accompanying him was able to disarm her. All right. And then the story became that she was a spiritist, and of course there were no records of this, and she was the niece of the Archbishop of Cordoba or something like that, and was a nun, and was basically the attack on Marinho was a very explicit, religiously motivated attack on someone she thought was channeling evil spirits rather than simply spirits. So she believed he was channeling spirits. I guess that's a plus. But Marinho is absolutely central to this institutionalization of spiritism. And his story, it's sort of taken me a while to make some sense of this. He was one of the co-founders of the newspaper La Prensa. He was its first editor, which within the realm of Latin American journalism is huge. This is a really, really significant newspaper. He eventually left that because he wasn't as interested in politics as he needed to be for that job. He then, a couple years later in 1871, there was a yellow fever outbreak in the city of Buenos Aires that was absolutely devastating, and in fact changed the landscape. If you go to Buenos Aires now, you can go into some of the old wealthy neighborhoods and look at these huge mansions that were abandoned during the yellow fever outbreak, and they're still there in terrible condition, but they're still there. He was one of the committee appointed to take care of relief, and among the members of this committee, an archivist sort of jokingly pointed out to me, he's the only member of this committee that does not have a street or a plaza named after him in the city of Buenos Aires. Every other member has a plaza or a street named after him. Marinho does not, and really the only explanation is he was dismissed as having sort of gone off the rails because of his embrace of spiritism. But he founded the main Spiritist society, Sociedad Constancia, which published a weekly newspaper. He was the editor of the newspaper. He wrote most of the material in the newspaper. He was an incredibly prolific writer and polemicist for Spiritists within Argentina. Wrote plays, wrote a novel, not a good novel, but he wrote a novel, and wrote sort of short inspirational pieces centered on sort of the equality of women and women as the sort of safeguard of religion's capability to ascribe meaning to phenomena. That women, without women, we would have lost that. It's actually some really interesting material at the end of the day. So what I'm going to look at now is a document that's part of the texts that were written to educate spiritists, educate people who are already fairly convinced of the belief, or to present spiritism, prevent convincing arguments for spiritism to people who were open-minded, who were spiritism curious. In other words, this is a document that's directed not at the people he's engaging in the polemic. It is, however, compiled from, it's a kind of synthesis of about a decade of polemics that he had with different sort of representatives of positivism within Argentina. So it's a kind of hybrid document called a light criticism, or a light critique of the positivist schools. And the advantage that he has here, the really clear advantage that he has here, is that there's no response coming from the positivists. There's no response that he's mischaracterizing them, or that he's mischaracterizing Spiritism, that he's covering up weaknesses of Spiritism. This is essentially a self-representation in the form of a polemic created from the sort of synthesis of accumulated real polemics. Okay, so his basic argument is that spiritists and what he calls experimental psychiatrists, parapsychologists essentially, have, through the methods of the positive sciences, clearly demonstrated the obsolescence of Comtean materialism as the basis for scientific inquiry. That using the methods of positivism, spiritists have undermined, have fundamentally disproved the materialist basis of positivism. And obsolescence is probably the best way to capture this, because his argument is essentially that spiritism embraces the methods of positivism and shows that positivist materialism is no longer scientifically valid, right? Can no longer be sustained in the face of empirical evidence. So his approach is to rests on a kind of creative recounting or reappropriation of Spiritism's founding myths, its moment of emergence as a doctrine, and he reworks this founding myth in order to appropriate positivist notions and recast positivist notions of the linear progress of human knowledge. Okay? So he's essentially going to insert the birth of positivism or the birth of Spiritism at a particular moment that situates it as the son or the child of positivism and the heir to positivism, without sort of allowing a space for claims that, no, there is a kind of metaphysical residue that accounts for Spiritist pseudoscience, which would be the obvious positivist counterclaim. So he starts by saying that there was a glacial wind of incredulity and mortal indifference extending throughout Europe as a consequence of the rise of Comtean positivism and other forms of atheistic materialism. You had a very rapid growth and enthusiasm for the physical sciences because they delivered, right? Because they had huge explanatory power, because they delivered a more comfortable life, they delivered on economic innovation, they made life more culturally interesting, and all of these benefits were impossible to dismiss. But the counterpart to this, and one of the reasons that positivism was able to do this, was that it destroyed dreams and utopias. It undermined the basis for religious belief. It undermined the basis for utopian belief. It silenced religion, which is one of the reasons why you could have this cultural flowering. But in silencing religion, it removed the positive aspects or the desirable aspects of religious belief from human activity, right? It engendered this glacial indifference to life. And the way that positivism did this to religion was by simply demanding proof, right? By simply saying, if God or if the soul exists, prove it. And the existing religions at the time couldn't. Right? They couldn't deliver on that basic challenge. They couldn't respond to positivism's demand for proof. Right? And as a result, you have this world that is demystified, but in being demystified is stripped of meaning. Right? It's stripped of meaning. You have no basis for morality other than sort of empty appeals to some sort of sense of altruism, and you have a generalized skepticism that makes life, essentially makes life gloomy, that makes life not worth living, and creates the possibility for, he has in some of his other writings, creates the possibility for a strongly authoritarian turn within revolutionary politics. He was a socialist, and one of the founders of the Argentine Socialist Party, actually. So then, this is the situation when positivism sort of exerts its power within European and then society in the Americas as well. And this is the moment when Spiritism emerges. Right? So here's where he puts the birth of Spiritism. And this is essentially the moment in which spirits reveal, engage in a revelation of the spirit world. Right? That this isn't something that finally people figured out, but rather this is a combination of people engaging in proper method of inquiry with regard to the spirit world, but also the spirits themselves, deciding that this was now needed. This was now needed in the sort of overall plan of the evolution of humanity. So Spiritism then, the spirits emerge and Spiritism emerges in order to reintegrate religious sentiment into men's hearts. Right? And here he uses the masculine. It's something that is a little bit problematic because he uses religion and this sentiment and women very, very directly in other texts and even in other parts of this text. So this is a kind of restoration of the good things of religion, and it also came to give to the positivist spirit of the 19th century the equally positive and tangible proof that it demanded. Right? Now here was the proof of the existence of the soul. Here was the proof of the existence of spirit beyond matter. Right? Spiritism essentially answered the challenge put to religions, answered it through the methods of positivism, right? And gave what for Marinho and his co-religionaries a coherent, empirical, verifiable evidence of this spirit world. Right? So he then is really, really explicit in arguing that Spiritism comes through positivism. It comes by engaging in the methods of inquiry of positivism. And what happened then was that people engaged in that method discovered that there was something beyond matter, right? That not everything could be derived from matter, not everything of import could be derived from matter. So this is part of his argument here. He says if Spiritism is, as we argue, a positive science, given that it is rooted in and supports itself on real facts, and from them deduces the laws that govern those facts, one must logically proclaim that it is the son or the child of scientific positivism. Spiritism then has inherited from scientific positivism the experimental method, and when it investigates or tries to clarify the truth, it accepts no other criteria than that which comes from the cold and serene observation of things. So Spiritism then is simply the consequence of the application of positivism. And this basically works the positivists into a corner, because what he's trying to do is force them to renounce the basic tenets of positivism in order to deny the validity of Spiritism. This is essentially what he's attempting to do. And then for good measure, he sort of throws in a handful of well-known positivists who have come to embrace Spiritism, the most famous of which was Cesare Lombroso, the founder of the Institute of Positivist Criminology in Italy, who in 1909 sort of had a conversion to Spiritism and pronounced it a consequence of his scientific inquiry, and that Spiritism was founded on coherent empirical evidence. Okay? So you have then Spiritism coming out of positivism, sort of inescapably coming out of the application of the methods of positivism. And then he says that what Spiritism does is it liberates positivism. It essentially allows positivism to move beyond the sort of obstacle of its own materialism. That now positivism can really engage in much grander projects like understanding the sort of the mysteries of the various states of matter, the interconnectedness of different forms of matter. It can now give Spiritism, the job that Spiritism has done now allows people in the positive sciences to deal with radiation, to figure out what that is, and to develop coherent theories about what radiation is. And it also has implications for the realm of psychology as well. So the Spiritism then becomes the heir of positivism. It simply becomes really the consequence of positivism. And one of the things that he's doing is he's playing into this notion, this sort of built-in evolutionary notion within positivism, that there's this sort of linear accumulation of knowledge. And so if you have this linear accumulation of knowledge and positivism starts here, and in its unfolding it produces Spiritism, Spiritism must be a higher state. It must be the successor, both chronologically and genealogically, to positivism. And I'm sort of conflicted in some of this. I mean, Marinho obviously really believed what he was saying to a large degree, in the sense that he really believed that there was empirical evidence of the existence of the soul, of its coherence, of its survival beyond death, and of communication with the spirit world. I have no doubt he was absolutely convinced of this. So that we can grant him pretty comfortably. I also think that he's not really engaged in a terribly atrocious sleight of hand by using positivist notions of the sort of evolutionary accumulation of knowledge or notions of linear progress in knowledge, and using arguments with regard to the methods of accumulating knowledge and turning that against positivism itself. I don't think he's really engaged in a conscious, I'm going to twist this around and figure this out. Where I think that this very nice man, by all accounts a very, very nice and very honest man, sort of is engaged in this sleight of hand, is in placing the birth of positivism